Signore e signori, grazie a nome di tutta la nostra comunità per la vostra presenza qui dall'Accademia Britannica, il nostro centro di eccellenza per ricerche nelle scienze umane, di lettere e delle belle arti. Accogliervi qui stasera ci dà il più pieno piacere. La nostra capacità di attirarvi i migliori esponenti di diverse discipline e pratiche è dimostrata dalla nostra serie di conferenze serali che siamo privilegiati a presentarvi ogni mercoledì. Invitiamo i più eminenti lettori come Professor Morgan per approfondire la nostra conoscenza del passato, ma anche per aprire nuovi modi ed inaspettati orientamenti di ricerca. Vi invito cordialmente di prendere un programma di nostri eventi dopo la conferenza. It's a pleasure, a privilege and a joy to have with us one of the most interesting and affable British classics professors, Llewelyn Morgan, here to deliver the next instalment of our Wednesday evening lecture series. Llewelyn is long-time fellow and top brass at Brasenose College, Oxford, where he is currently associate professor in classical language and literature in the Faculty of Classics. As such, a distinguished and prestigious role would both demand and recognize. Llewelyn has published extremely widely, addressing the Golden Age Augustan literary giants like Virgil, Ovid, and Horace, in his own golden scholarship, which is always witty, original, and extremely insightful. Llewelyn's many research interests stretch to include the study of coins, the classical tradition, the Greeks in India, and in 2012 he wrote a searching book on the Buddhas of central Afghanistan that were obliterated by Islamic fundamentalists back in 2001. The BSR, as ever, has its finger right on the pulse, both in terms of inviting the most distinguished guest speakers, Exhibit A, but also in terms of reflecting many of the significant cultural developments that are taking place within this wonderful city in which we're so fortunate to live and to work. As many of you will know, at the end of last year, the vast Imperial ramp on the Palatine, built for the Emperor Domitian, was opened for the very first time to the public, a significant parallel theme to tonight's paper. We're extremely grateful to Llewelyn for being here, who stepped off a plane just now and managed to squeeze in 3 hours beneath the Lateran Basilica before coming straight here to share with us some of his new research on royal flush, Domitian's high colour and its significance. We're extremely proud to have you here, so please join me in extending a very warm welcome for an exposition of Domitian with erudition from an Oxford academician, Professor Llewelyn Morgan.
Well, thank you very much, but those kinds of introductions always make me extremely nervous. They raise expectations. I should correct one thing before I start, possibly, that this is research I'm coming back to. This is research that a lot of it probably I was more on top of about 10 years ago. I intend to continue with it now, having been distracted by things like the Buddhas of Bamiyan and Mita and these kinds of things. But there probably was a time when I was younger and the research was fresher, when my recall of parallel passages, for example, was slightly stronger than it is now. However, I still find this stuff fascinating. I hope I can communicate something of that. Right, my point of departure here is an assertion, my assertion, but the truth of which I hope will emerge as I speak, or some of the truth of which will emerge as I speak, that the Emperor Domitian, emperor from 81 to 96 AD, was, in his day, an abnormally visible head of state, both in the literature of his reign, the literature written during his reign, but also in the traumatized literary aftermath of his reign. Domitian is regularly the focus of intense attention. And I don't just mean there that there was a preoccupation with the emperor's character, policies, virtues, and vices, though, of course, there was all of that. My concern, rather, is with what seems to be a remarkably developed interest within Domitianic literature, and I'm spreading the net widely there, both responses to Domitian like Pliny's Panegyricus, but also poetry written under Domitian. A remarkably developed interest within that literature in the emperor's physical appearance. Specifically, Rome in the late 1st century AD seems to me to have been nothing short of fixated with Domitian's face. Now, as we will see, as you may already know, Domitian had, or could be claimed to have had, quite a striking physiognomy. But what seems different, to me at any rate, about the response to Domitian is the prominence that's accorded his facial peculiarity in the literature that survives to us. Now, an occasional motif in this talk, probably too occasional in this talk, will be an acknowledgement that there's no fundamental break or departure represented by Domitian's reign. There are precedents for everything he did, and Domitian's successors in turn display a striking continuity with his reign, despite the fact that it's they like to insist that it's anomalous. Often it seems very much otherwise. For that matter, nothing is more stereotypically Roman than spectacle. And this is the point where one has to quote Foucault saying, to render accessible to a multitude of men the inspection of a small number of objects was the problem to which the architecture of temples, theatres and circuses responded in Rome. And in broad terms, that's obviously true. Nevertheless, there seems to me a je ne sais quoi about Domitian, something that makes him stand out, a greater intensity, a lack of subtlety that pushes the person of this emperor and the intimate details of his physical appearance very forcibly to the front. So what I'm discussing today, what I'm going to discuss today, is I think at least an interesting symptom of that characteristic of his principate. That will try and suggest things that symptom might indicate, the underlying disease that might indicate. Now for openers, and I apologise for the amount of text I'm going to put on the screen, but I'm a literary critic, I don't do images really, or only do them ineptly. Whereas, but for openers, a panegyric of Domitian by Marshall, who was responsible for quite a number of panegyrics of Domitian. It probably won't be to everybody's taste, and won't either, I don't think, seem especially original. But here we go. Morning star, bring back the day. Why do you retard our joy? Caesar is coming. Morning star, bring back the day. Rome asks you, does the lazy wagon of gentle Boeotes carry you, that you come with so slow a fire? You could have taken, and then there's a sort of a set of mythical horses that could have been borrowed. Killorus from Leda's constellation, Castor himself will give up his mount to you now. Why do you hold back the eager Titan, the sun? Already Xanthus and Ithone crave the rains. Memnon's fostering mother is awake, the dawn is waking. Yet the slow stars yield not to shining dawn, and the moon desires to see you, the leader of the Italians. Come now, Caesar, night though it be. Let the stars stand still. When you come at your advent, the people will not want for day. Now, we're in AD 93 here, and Domitian is returning from what is known as the Second Pannonian War, and the basic trope of this poem is clear enough. Rome is yearning for the return of its leader and cannot wait for night to be finished with and for the joyful day of his return to arrive. The night drags on as if travelling in the plough of Boeotes, but no matter. let Domitian arrive in the middle of the night and it will still be daytime. Let's all be quietly sick. Domitian is the sun, in other words, and that as a panegyrical strategy, the association of the monarch with the giver of light, the bringer of warmth, the single brightest thing in the firmament is very, very readily paralleled. We think of Le Roi Soleil, or Akhenaten, for that matter. In greater proximity to Domitian, we might think of Nero, whether his his colossal statue represented him of the sun, or established an assimilation in some fashion. Nevertheless, we have plenty of evidence, including this text, which I won't read in extenso, which constructs a close association of Nero with the sun. Now, I'm playing down that passage of the Apocolocyntosis a little bit, because it goes a bit beyond treating Nero as the sun. It also, and I leave you to read it, but it also dwells upon Nero's face and his hair. It's concerned with the physical minutiae of Nero, in other words. And that makes it an interesting example of a kind of sacralization of the body of the emperor. But it's also something that's very common indeed as a panegyrical strategy, a panegyrical motif perhaps better, in Domitianic poetry. The tying of solar or stellar imagery to the emperor's features. And what partly made it, I think significantly made it, so common in the case of Domitian, was that in his case, this rather predictable conceit of surrounding the monarch with imagery of light and fire is given renewed force by the actualities of his facial appearance, which made the symbolism particularly appropriate to him. Well, to cut to the chase, Domitian had a high colour. He had an unusually florid or flushed complexion. And while we hear about that, as we expect to, from Suetonius is very committed to giving physiognomical descriptions of emperors, it turns out to be a point of reference across the spectrum of ancient authors that write about this emperor to a very striking and peculiar degree, I think. Now, those authors, and I'll get to give you more examples than you can possibly desire of authors talking about this kind of stuff, but those authors gloss Domitian's blush in a variety of ways. I think it lies behind that poem of Martial, actually, at some level. And I'll set about investigating some of them in a second. But where I start what I have to say here and end it is by posing the prior question of why Domitian's contemporaries display this unhealthy concern for his complexion. What is it about Domitian that generates this peculiarly intimate engagement with his image? Or why does the face of Domitian so monopolize the view? So I did warn you there'd be quite a lot of text. Yes, and also they're not very good at PowerPoint as well. That's probably fairly obvious. The lines were particularly impressive, I think. Now let me do, though, what I'm doing here is what I should already have done long ago, which is ground my claim to some degree that Rome was indeed preoccupied with Domitian's face specifically. Suetonius is indeed a good place to start. He's, here we go, he's here. But Suetonius is already showing Domitian's physical appearance being transformed, in this instance by Domitian himself, he quotes Domitian's own words, into what we could call material for promotion of the emperor. So he refers to his colouring twice. I've underlined it in the English, at any rate, with a modest expression and a high colour. And then at the end of this little vignette, he was so conscious that the modesty of his expression was in his favour that he once made this boast in the Senate: "So far, at any rate, you've approved my heart and my countenance." usquad certet animum meum probastis et vultum. Now, Domitian's complexion is associated with a range of terms in Suetonius's account there. Modestus, verecundia, all of which denote essentially a high sensitivity to moral proprieties, an enhanced sense of decency. And there's also a suggestion in his self-presentation to the Senate of youthful deference. So this particular look as a youthful look, that's something that I'll fill out a bit later on. But it's noteworthy that the other references to Domitian's blush on this slide, and at this stage we're looking at exclusively hostile accounts of the emperor, so written after his death by Tacitus and Pliny. While they focus in on his face and they use Domitian's facial characteristics to denigrate him, also seem to be using similar terms to Domitian's own. So in the Agricola, up here, up there, okay, it's interesting, won't do that again. Domitian's constant blush prevents any display of pudor, shame, a word close in sense to modestia, and verecundia, shame that he might feel at his own heinous actions. While Pliny explains his colouring as a sign that he's perpetually committing shameful acts. At least I think that's what Pliny is saying. And there's another chunk of Tacitus there from the histories recounting events long before Domitian's accession back in AD 70, again highlighting this flush that Domitian had, and one ready interpretation that it encouraged, that he was a young man possessed of modestia to an unusual degree. But I think what's kind of interesting about the overtly negative responses to Domitian is that they still seem trapped in this particular interpretation of his high colouring. Both Pliny and Tacitus are trying to turn a clear indication of modestia into negative conclusions about him. Now, probably the most significant take-home from what I say today, and I'm prepared to accept it isn't awfully significant, but nevertheless, is that whether praising Domitian or denigrating and blaming Domitian, Domitian's face always seems to be the focus of interest, or very often seems to be the focus of interest. But what I'd like to spend quite a lot of time doing is delving the rather richer resource represented by the positive panegyrical readings of Domitian's face, such as we find in Statius and Martial. And starting off with this slide by simply establishing quite how important a theme of this poetry Domitian's face was. What we have at the top here is a chunk of Statius's poem of thanks for his dinner in the royal palace, which treats the emperor himself as the most impressive thing of all in a Domus Flavia that he is lavishly celebrated. I think this certainly communicates to me that the very peculiar degree to which his face is prominent in the poet's minds. But not for the viands or the Moorish wood resting on the Indian columns, or the ordered troops of servants have my eager gaze the time. For him, only him, calm of visage, softening its radiance with serene majesty, modestly lowering the banner of his fortune, yet the hidden splendour shone in his face. And he compares him to various heroes, Hercules and so on. I speak of little things, nor yet, Domitian, do I match your aspect. So looks the leader of the high ones, Jupiter himself, when he revisits ocean's limits and the banquets of the Ethiopians, his sacred countenance diffused with nectar, and bids the muses sing secret songs, and Phoebus laud the Gigantomachy, by which the Olympian gods defeated the giants. Okay, a fairly extreme example of what I'm talking about there from Statius, but underneath a birthday poem from Martial, Domitian's birthday in 87, I think we are here, which does similar things. Come Caesar's life-giving day, more hallowed than the dawn on which Ida did privately will conceal Jupiter. Last you long, I pray, and come in greater number than Nestor lived. Ever shine with your countenance of today, or one fairer still. Semper et hoc vultu vel meliore nite. Now, I could quote many more examples. You're probably begging for mercy by the time I've finished. I couldn't, for reasons that I explained earlier. This is research that I was most on top of a while ago. Do it all off the top of my head. But what these examples on their own start to illustrate are some of the ways in which Domitian's complexion could be spun or metaphorized. They illustrate, as I suggest, a peculiar fixation with Domitian's complexion. That's all right. But also what could be done with that complexion by the poets, propaganda terms or whatever. Now, without getting close to exhausting the subtleties of these very elaborate exercises in praise, and they are both elaborate and subtle as well as, quite offensive at the same time. Statius clearly associates Domitian's physiognomy with Jupiter, and Martial, albeit slightly more obliquely, with youthfulness, because it's youthfulness that on his birthday he's requesting for the emperor. So if he's saying to him, ever shine as you currently do, or shine even more shinily, he's saying, stay young, or if possible, get younger. Well, both these ways of reading a red face, Jupiter and youth, can be paralleled, though in the first instance only very tentatively, and I'm suggesting here ways in which we might contemplate pursuing the connection with reference to the triumph. Pliny, here, talks of red painted faces, referring to the triumphing general and Jupiter himself. And I shall read it. Varius gives, so referring to an earlier antiquarian, gives a list of writers of unquestionable authority who say that on holidays it was the custom for the face of the statue of Jupiter himself to be coloured with cinnabar, as well as the bodies of persons going in a triumphal procession. And that Camillus was so coloured in his triumph, and that under the same ritual it was usual even in their day for cinnabar to be added to the unguents used at a banquet in honour of a triumph, and that one of the first duties of the censors was to place a contract for painting Jupiter with cinnabar. Now, these cannot be considered documentary accounts either of statues of Jupiter or of triumphators, since Pliny's talking about them as emphatically past phenomena. In fact, he's talking about them as things that this Augustan antiquarian, Varius Flaccus, considered as past phenomena. But I'd like to sort of experiment with the idea, I suppose, that an association between reddened faces and the Triumphator and the Jupiter could gain a certain currency precisely from antiquarian accounts of things by Varius or by Pliny in turn for that matter. Certainly that might explain this peculiar turn of phrase in the Historia Augusta at the top there, where Gordian I is described as having a red face, but he's described as having a pompalis vultus, apparently a face associated with a procession, with the triumphal procession, it seems. Okay, what we also have here on the other side, Martial 865, is Domitian in triumphal mode again, and with his face blazing. Here stood Caesar, beauteous with the dust of northern warfare, pouring brilliant radiance from his countenance. And also at the bottom there, an association established between the appearance of Jupiter and the appearance of Domitian. Marshall there is talking about a statue of a shrine of Hercules with a statue that has the features of Domitian, but he says actually a better match would be the statue of Jupiter, Capitoline Jupiter himself. Now, it's a far from powerful argument. It's the opposite of a powerful argument in this, I think. But both of these poems would have a lot more point if a reddened complexion evoked Jupiter or evoked the Triumphator, the triumphing general. Certainly Martial and Statius aren't the only evidence of a triumphal image that Domitian sought to foster. We're told that he gained the right to wear triumphal dress into the Senate, though I don't know how much weight we give that statement by Dio. But what I'm suggesting, of course, is that the poets used Domitian's ruddy complexion not only to reinforce an association of Domitian with Jupiter, whose temple on the Capitoline he'd rebuilt and with whom he liked to maintain a particular association, but also to present him as a kind of natural born or perpetual triumphing general. He never stops being a triumphal general. He always has this redness of face. Okay, well, I'm on altogether safer ground in claiming that an underlying theme of this physiognomical material that we find associated with Domitian is the emperor's preternatural beauty. The idea that his blush might be a mark of beauty and especially of youthful beauty. You have a moment from Seneca. I've got a strong feeling that should be 11:1 rather than 1:11, but my phone has died, so I couldn't check it. But saying something which doesn't come as any awful surprise to us, that a blush is a good sign in a young man, a sign of, well, modestia. Pliny, in his speech to Trajan, summarizes all the flattery that Domitian received as pretty much this. Namely, they all gave the same acclamation now to one emperor for his valor, as another had a short time for his good looks. So that is Domitian being described as formorsum. In Martial 5:7, meanwhile, across the other side, we have a combination of beauty and youth embodied in Domitian's face, with reference to the youth and the beauty that he was allegedly restoring to Rome. So now has a new Rome thrown off her ancient length of days and taken on the countenance of her ruler, et sumpsit voltus praesidis ipsa sui. Now the passage of Statius Silvae 4:1 is there just to give an example of something that is a topos extremely common within the Silvae, which is God's promise to Domitian of a very long-lasting youth. In this case, it's Janus, who knows a lot about time, and the passage of time, who promises it to him. Now, the insistence on Domitian's youth and the prayers that it should last forever that are so common in Statius in particular have something to do with Domitian's comparative youth at the time of his succession. They probably also have something to do with the attention that Domitian gave to his own exploits as a very young man during the civil war of 69 to 70. You've got an illustration of that kind of material in the Silius at the bottom there. I think there's also a kind of what we might call an Elizabethan quality to this too. Poets insisting that a monarch whose succession is insecure is, even at the age of 44, which is as old as he got, blessed with youth. Now, I talk about the insecurity of his succession. There's a coin at the bottom here, which is an image or other Baroque but still quite touching image of his dead son who's been turned into a god. There was an issue about what would happen after Domitian. Well, it's Domitian's blush that I'm talking about here, but it's bound up with all of this. His blush is an index of youth and its attendant qualities. Now, Tacitus, who I quoted before, shows the Senate interpreting his complexion as the sign of a healthy and unconceited young man. And the Suetonius passage that we saw early on as well suggests that that Domitian could look for a similar response from the Senate at what is apparently a later date. Martial's poem here probably dates to AD 90, when Domitian was nearly 40. So not a young man, but certainly an emperor who could benefit from being understood as a young man and as somebody possessed of the virtues of a young man. Okay, well, some especially fancy footwork here. Not that I've been particularly fancy my footwork so far, but you know what I mean. To land myself in what may be the most important of all Domitian's modes of self-projection. And what I'm talking about here is Domitian's reanimation of the semi-obsolete office of the censorship. He had himself appointed censor and then had himself appointed censor perpetuus, perpetual censor. Now, much of the activity, especially associated with Domitian, it seems possible to connect to his holding of this office, since the censorship was concerned with more than a maintenance of moral behaviour. The big passage of Suetonius that I'm certainly not going to read is concerned with his moral legislation, moral actions within Rome. But in fact, the role of cura morum that the censor had was understood to encompass a much broader spectrum of activity than the moral behaviour of citizens. Most strikingly for me, at any rate, but probably most importantly and most obviously actually, construction took place under the aegis of the censor. So as Statius makes very clear in Silvae 4:3, his poem all about the Via Domitiana, all about this road that Domitian built along the Campanian coast down to Cumae and Puteoli, as he was building that road as censor. It was quae censor that he was building that road, as surely as Appius Claudius Caecus, the censor, had been acting as censor when he had the Via Appia built. I couldn't resist putting this amazing image of the Via Domitiana that I found on the interweb, doing my thing. Sort of modern houses surrounding a chunk of the Via Domitiana near Caserta. I think that's the link to the blog that talks about it. But getting back to my topic, the qualities that we've seen associated with Domitian's complexion, modestia, pudor, verecundia, and that Domitian himself, we have evidence, made strenuous efforts to assign to himself, still resonate very closely with the essential ethos of the censorship, an office that reformed Rome, that reset it to a pristine state, which is what Martial is talking about in that poem at the top. Well, with the censorship in mind, here we have 3 epigrams from Book 5 of Martial, datable to AD 89 or 90. One of them has already been seen. 2 of them are concerned with Domitian's reforms as censor, his enforcement of seating rules in the theatre, his architectural reconstruction of Rome after the fire, and the fire of AD 80 is the main point of reference. And the other requests of Parthenius, Domitian's chamberlain, and probably later Domitian's assassin, a presentation of his Martial's book to the emperor. Now, Domitian's appearance is explicitly cited in 2 of these poems, obliquely in the other, I think, and that appearance is young, beautiful, placidus, peaceful, settled, suggestive of a sunny sky, which, when applied to a face, might suggest youth and beauty, and morality, when applied to a city, might suggest the orderly, or to a censor rather, the order that he would bring to a city. Again, there's a network of associations, of renewal, order, but still with this intense concentration on the physical appearance of the emperor at the heart of it. Somehow, Domitian's activities, whether as general or censor or as common or garden administrator, seem to entail for Domitianic poets contemplation of his face. And as I've made fairly clear, I find this really rather peculiar. Well, I've suggested that the censorship was central to Domitianic ideology, and while the overtly moralizing measures and the building exercises are the clearest examples of his censorial activity, the impression I get, at any rate, is that his censorial motivation is rather all-pervasive. There's a fascinating collection of poems dating from AD 94 that are all concerned with one of Domitian's retainers named Aearinus. Aearinus being, or having been, the emperor's cupbearer. Now the poems, and I've listed the poems there if anybody's interested, focus upon a ceremony that had taken place in Pergamum, Aearinus' home city. And what had happened in this ceremony was that Aearinus, who was a eunuch, had had his long hair cut short and had dedicated that hair to Asclepius. Asclepius, the god of medicine, of course, who had a celebrated shrine come hospital at Pergamum. Now, the symbolism of cutting his hair points to Aearinus' manumission. Domitian sets him free at round about this time, and also points to, well, somewhat strikingly, considering his eunuch status, to his achievement of maturity as a man. The cutting of the hair indicated both puberty and an end to slavery. That, at any rate, seems to be the implication of all this, that Aearinus has, as it were, transcended his castration and become a man. Well, I've written about this somewhere else. I'm not sure when that somewhere else will actually come out. But an issue in the scholarship is the seeming awkwardness of this elaborate celebration of a eunuch, and neither of the authors, Martial or Statius, are in any way playing down his status and the controversialness of that status. It wasn't a very respectable thing to be a eunuch at this point. The awkwardness of a celebration of a eunuch, coming as it does from the court of an emperor who had, as censor, made much of his enforcement of laws against castration. Now, I think it's fair to say that in the scholarship, the consensus is that Domitian's affection for Aearinus, affection for this eunuch, exposes him as a hypocrite. But my own conclusion, it's probably a sign that I'm just getting a bit too close to Domitian, too willing to give him the time of day. But in this instance, on the contrary, Domitian was being the perpetual censor all over. In other words, there's no contradiction between an emperor who legislated against castration on the one hand and one who endorsed a ceremony that symbolically transformed a eunuch into a respectable Roman citizen. In both cases, you're correcting this crime or this unnatural act of castrating. Okay, I add at the top there, for anybody who's interested, a moment from Frontinus' Stratagems, fascinating text, but a moment where what has happened periodically in Frontinus, he's talking about jolly cunning things that generals have done, and just salts it, his text, with some moments when Domitian did particularly canny things, almost as if he was writing it under Domitian or something like that. But in this particular example, his role as censor has a role to play in his cunning plan. But Domitian's reforms extended deep into the administration of the emperor. He's unusual, as we shall see, for his administrative activity. But in a particularly striking instance, he got himself involved with the coinage to an unusual degree. In one of his earliest measures in late AD 82, Domitian raised the fineness of the silver denarius from about 87.5% to about 98%. I haven't tested that myself. But what he was doing thereby was restoring the fineness of the denarius to the standard of Augustus. And simultaneously, the aureus, the gold coin, was restored to Augustan standard. Now, the denarius could not maintain that standard. The economic realities apparently were not such as it could be maintained, though the aureus did stay at that level. But as an action, it's a very intriguing one, which the people who know more about coinage are very clear should be understood as no kind of economic measure in any modern sense, and much more a moral measure, a measure true to one aspect of the censor's activities. So I quote Walker on this, saying, it is probably in this context that the improvement in the currency is to be seen. To restore the purity of the denarius to the level which it had enjoyed under the Republic, and to restore the aureus to the weight of Augustus, would have been considered to be morally good and laudable in their own right, symbolic perhaps of the restoration of pristine moral purity and of the age of gold. And I think that's absolutely right. It doesn't make any economic sense what he's doing here. In fact, it's economically inept probably, but that's not the point. It's a moral matter. Well, I'm still thinking about censors here, and the responsibilities of censors might indeed be defined as supreme control of the state economy, as Suolati says. Crawford, in his discussion of early Roman coinage, has some quite intriguing thoughts about the role of censors in that early Roman coinage. But Domitian only formally seems to declare himself censor after this coin reform. So it's probably safest to see all this as a commitment to the rejuvenation of Rome. One aspect of which is mucking about with the silver content of the denarius, another expression of which is the censorship. I've put on the handout, on the handout, you see what I'm doing here, on the screen, his sanction against the Vestal Virgin Cornelia, buried alive for adultery, an extreme example of his censorial morality. But Pliny explicitly presents it as undertaken by Domitian in his role as Pontifex Maximus. And there are comparable issues related to the secular games that Domitian held in AD 88 as well. Claudius had held secular games, and in association with being censor, or so some people think. But again, what we seem to be looking at is a generalizing reforming zeal. And the more important point is that once again the emperor's freshness and modesty of facial demeanor is integral to that project of reform. Okay, well, I digressed in the direction of censorship there because it's all far too interesting, at any rate for a literary critic with a tenuous grip on Roman constitutional matters. It's probably not very interesting for anybody else. Anyway, it's time to consider, I think, explanations, or time to attempt some provisional explanations of Rome's fixation on its emperor's face, always on the assumption that I've established that fixated it was. A phenomenon somewhat parallel to what I'm seeing in the literature is a consistent tendency on Domitian's part for robust intervention in Roman life. As observed in one of the standard biographies of Domitian by Jones, with particular reference to Domitian's administrative activity. I'll just quote a bit of Jones here. By any criteria, the Roman Empire's dimensions were substantial, but as many have observed, their administrative system was not. The term imperial bureaucracy is a misnomer. administrative officials were remarkably few. In practice, the emperor had to depend on the local provincial elite for many of the tasks one might have expected to be assigned to an army of imperial bureaucrats. Domitian was never guilty of that, or indeed ever accused of it. He was personally involved, or perhaps engrossed, in just about every aspect of the administration of the capital and of the empire. The economy was his special concern, and he goes and talks about what he did to the coinage. Now, actually Jones goes on to draw a parallel between what Domitian does and what Augustus does, but Augustus isn't actually such a good precedent in many respects for the degree of engagement with the minutiae of imperial administration that Domitian displayed. Jones says, elsewhere, Domitian, in a way that's singularly unlike Augustus, stressed the reality of his autocracy, made no effort to disguise what he regarded as the nature of the principate. His was a personal monarchy, and he saw himself as a benevolent despot. This intense attention that Domitian directed upon Rome, upon Rome's administration, upon its people, was clearly experienced by some of his subjects in very, very personal terms, reflected as clearly, I think, in the positive as the negative accounts that he attracted. Now, we've already seen, I put it on the screen at any rate, Tacitus's recollection of the sort of intense and inescapable gaze that the emperor directed upon his people. And we can add to that Pliny's ghastly memory of his basilisk glare, spectator ad notatorque convivis tuis. He invites people to dinner, and then he looks at them and he checks everything that they're doing. But again, there's a positive version of this. We've seen it already in Statius's account of the dinner, where it's not just Domitian looking at Statius, it's Statius basking in the sunlight of Domitian's look. But we also have a moment from the first poem of Book 5 of Statius Silvae, describing the protective concern that Domitian lavished on Abascantus, husband of the dead Priscilla, Abascantus being Domitian's, one of Domitian's secretary ab epistolis. And the attention on Domitian's gaze here, but in a very positive sense, is indeed intense. You were heard and fortune came with kind step. Surely he saw the devoted young man's quiet diligence, his untainted loyalty, his mind alert for business, his watchful intelligence, his sober judgment, fitted to unfold great matters as they arose. He saw, who knows all about those near to him and surrounds every quarter with well-tried servants. No wonder he sees east and west, what the south wind is about and what the wintry north, probing counsels of sword and gown, and the very heart. I put the marshal there just to summarize this point, that there's a profound ambiguity about the very same phenomenon. An emperor who is intensely involved in everything can provoke the response that we get in Tacitus, or that impression of fatherly concern, or big brotherly perhaps, concern for every part of people's lives, but very much to their benefit. But Marshall simply imagines the response of Rome's enemies when they see him. Rome's enemy sees Earth's Lord nearer at hand. The barbarian quails before your countenance and enjoys it. Tuo quateretur vultu barbarus et fruitur. A very intriguing idea. Okay, well, it isn't hard to conclude that one's response to Domitian's interventionism was likely to vary depending on one's social class, depending on the degree to which Domitian's assertion of superiority was felt as offensive. If this was the character of his practical administration, it was also, as Jones suggests, true of the profile that Domitian gave himself in the physical city. The Flavian amphitheatre, referred to in the martial poem up there, obviously offered unprecedented opportunity for the emperor to display himself to his people, to see and be seen, and Martial makes much of that. But Domitian also seems to have deliberately made of the area palatina, so the area in front of this remarkable facade, an opportunity to be seen by petitioners and others before the temple-like structure behind them. Now, the images here are from Ulrika Wolf-Wright, by the way. There's a bibliography at the very end of this, but in case I forget to put it up. Now, as I understand it, Sanka's idea that the grand porticoed apse on the circus side of the palace, which Sanka reads as symbolizing, I quote, the constant presence of the emperor, doesn't quite work out chronologically. That's perhaps a slightly later development, but it's fair to say that slightly later development advanced an existent Domitianic project, the image is slightly closer to me there, to increase the visibility of the imperial presence for the crowds in the circus, both through how he presented himself directly in the circus, but also in the prominence of the Palatine Palace behind it. Now that seems to me to place Domitianic architecture on a continuum between Domitian's intervention in Roman administration and the intense awareness of the emperor's presence portrayed in the literature. Domitian was also giving physical shape to his dominance in the city's architecture. Well, the unsympathetic sources insist on the proliferation of sculptural images of the emperor across Rome during Domitian's reign. And indeed, the entire collection of Statius Silvae, passage at the bottom there, opens with a description of the gigantic mounted statue of Domitian in the Forum, another triumphal artwork and a poem with lots and lots and lots to say about the features and the prominence of the emperor. In combination with the statues, the sources emphasize arches, and Suetonius records an absolutely inspired piece of protest graffiti scribbled on one of them. Arche was written, or perhaps archi in Latin, which means both arches and enough already, so stop building. What the exasperation of that Flavian Banksy implies is presumably, only presumably, not an aesthetic objection to the architectural form itself, so much as to what the arch represents, the arch being not the least self-promoting of architectural constructions. And Suetonius also mentions Domitian's, again, un-Augustan habit of attaching his own name to buildings that he reconstructed. Now, there's one other place, just one other place, I promise, where Domitian's image confronted his subjects with unusual intensity. We've considered his close attention to the precious metal content of his currency, but as Caradice explains, the appearance of his coinage was also micro-managed, the designs on his coinage. The designs on the coinage also have close connections with the emperor. There is nothing particularly unusual in this, but what is extraordinary, I'm quoting Caradice here, is the extent to which Domitian or his influence dominates typology. Not only does Domitian himself appear on an unprecedented quantity of designs, but the deities which appear most commonly also had, in contemporary legend, the most intimate associations with him. So Domitian's face, if I were to be literally critical and glib about this, I would say was quite unavoidable. Even if you reached into your pockets, you would find Domitian there. So I just changed the slide. I did, yes, good. So, as I reach my conclusion, I appropriately am dealing with Domitian's conclusion, because I'm inclined to think that events immediately after Domitian's murder in 96 confirm rather vividly the fixation that Rome had developed with his face. Domitian's demise was attended by what might be considered a rather classic Damnatio memoriae, and it's always important to acknowledge that such action to destroy the legacy of a hated political figure had something of the formality of a ritual. Damnatio memoriae had a syntax, as Stuart suggests. It shouldn't ever be considered a straightforwardly spontaneous response on the part of its agents. Nevertheless, Flower, in her big book on Damnatio, provides evidence enough that the erasure of Domitian's name and image was, on the one hand, enacted empire-wide. It was obviously coordinated, and Suetonius refers to a senatorial decree, but also that it all had a peculiar intensity. And certainly the descriptions of what senators in particular got up to after Domitian's death are remarkable in their way. I feel they are anyway, and I shall read them. The senators, on the contrary, were so overjoyed that they raced to fill the house, where they did not refrain from assailing the dead emperor with the most insulting and singing kind of outcries. They even had ladders brought, and his shields and images torn down before their eyes and dashed upon the ground. Finally, they passed a decree that his inscription should everywhere be erased, and all record of his obliterated. So you can't treat any moment of Suetonius as objective historical fact or anything like that, but I like the fact that they remember who they are and pass a decree after they've sort of clambered up ladders and chucked stuff to the ground and jumped on top of it. But an even more remarkable passage of Pliny. Of your statues, Trajans, only one or two are to be seen in the vestibule of the Temple of Jupiter Best and Highest, and these are made of bronze, whereas only recently every approach and step, every inch of the precinct was gleaming with silver and gold, or rather was casting pollution, since the figures of the gods were defiled by having statues of an incestuous emperor in their midst. And so your few statues of bronze stand and will stand as long as the temple itself, whereas those innumerable golden images as a sacrifice to public rejoicing lie broken and destroyed. It was our delight to dash those proud faces to the ground, to smite them with the sword and savage them as if blood and agony could follow from every blow. Our transports of joy, so long deferred, were unrestrained. All sought a form of vengeance in beholding those bodies mutilated, limbs hacked in pieces, and finally that baleful, fearsome visage cast into fire to be melted down, so that from such menacing terror something for man's use and enjoyment should rise out of the flames. Very similar terms to Juvenal's description of the pulling down of the statue of Sejanus, and it reminds us that there's a lot of Domitian in Sejanus at that point. Okay, well, one thing we might note here is how concentrated the reaction, at least according to these sources, seems to have been in the societal group that was most disadvantaged by Domitian's autocracy, the senatorial class, in other words. Personally, I can't help but see in them not only actions comparable to the blistering verbal assaults preserved in Tacitus and Pliny, but also, in their own way, reflections of a fixation on the emperor's physicality and face that had more in common with the panegyrical accounts of Statius and Martial than Pliny would have been prepared to accept. But if Pliny isn't here describing members of the elite working through their anxiety about being rendered powerless by a massively charismatic figure of authority, well, I'm a banana, quite frankly. That seems psychology 101 here. Anyway, at some level, what the posthumous response to Domitian illustrates as well is the potency of Domitian's ideology as formulated poetically, architecturally, and otherwise. Shadi Barch's book that's on the reading this at the end, the bibliography at the end here, is particularly good on the difficulty that Pliny has in the Panegyricus in escaping from the influence of Domitianic propaganda. And I've suggested also, or self-promotion, I've suggested also that even as they criticize Domitian, they focus on his face. They're still preoccupied with his face, but also seem to be using the same terms as the panegyrical terms, trying to twist the panegyrical terms of modestia, shame, and so on. Now, to conclude, none of this, I don't think, is any profound surprise. It's a familiar view of Domitian that he eschewed the tact of most of his imperial predecessors and presented himself without compunction as an autocratic leader. The societal group most disadvantaged by this was inevitably the senatorial elite, and it is they, whether they're writing or whether they're clambering up ladders, who are most visible taking vengeance against his image. Now, there's an argument that Domitian exposed the real nature of the Principate so that his successors didn't have to, and that the nature of his successors' regimes, as reflected in Pliny's adulation of Trajan, for example, or the continued embellishment of the palace on the Palatine, indicate that there was vastly more continuity between Domitian and later emperors than they chose to acknowledge. Yes, a strong impression, fundamentally, of an emperor condemned for being appropriately engaged in the running of empire, which is an implication of what Jones has to say, for example. To conclude, we have on the left-hand side, and I'm not going to read all of it by any means, some indisputably servile language from Quintilian in the preface to the fourth book of the Institutio Oratoria. Explicable to some extent because Quintilian has just been given the honour of having entrusted to him the education of Domitian's grandnephews. Is that right, I think? Now, I'm inclined to overread the bit that I've put in Latin at the bottom here. Quintilian's description of Domitian as a god, quotes, more immediate and more helpful to his intellectual activities, not only for the elevation of Domitian into divinity, but because the Latin word praesens, in a way, encapsulates how I see the figure of Domitian functioning in the texts concerned with his Principate. To summarize, whether prying maliciously into their every move, or assisting them at every stage, whether bathing them in his life-giving light, or making them cower before his overwhelming brilliance, with Domitian, the emperor had become an object of fascination for his subjects, whether that fascination was morbid or whether that fascination was salutary. Thank you.
Exceptionally thoughtful and original in how high colour could be such an effective rubric under which to study, get to the heart of so much of Domitian's enigmatic character, but also his political interventions, and really gets us at so many paradoxes. It's very capable and interesting. And before, and many of you, I'm sure, will the opportunity to pick Llewelyn's brains, just begin, and I think this will be, apologise, a beginner question in more ways than one. I was interested very much in that Tacitus Agricola passage, which is, to me, so clever how he warps this feature of Domitian's running face into becoming this amazing sort of double downfall. On the one hand, it's revealing his shame, what way that he plays off this against the paleness, the white terror of the senators who are watching his house. Seems like a really interesting contrast, and I don't know whether you come across in your literary travels this sort of contrast, and whether or not whiteness, no colour, lack of colour, something that's employed this interesting.
Well, it's certainly, it's I mean, not in my literary travels, but in Bradley's book on colour in Roman literature, the blush and pallor, on the other hand, are things that go together. I mean, they don't seem to be sort of considered in a certain in combination. I mean, by him, but also he finds in the text as well. I mean, these are all rather fascinating passages where authors of sort of intense ability engage with Domitian and do what they can, to the particular ends that they have. Obviously, in the case of Tacitus, in the Agricola, to denigrate Domitian, sort of turn his physique into an indication of his moral shortcomings. I suppose, I mean, an important thing to say, it's not directly what you were asking about, but I mean, a lot of the discussion at the moment to do with physiognomy is the extent to which the ancients were convinced that particular physical appearances indicated very straightforwardly characteristics of those persons. So if you read crazy people like Polymo, if you have a sort of sharp nose, you're like a bird, and so you have all the characteristics of birds and those kinds of things. The understanding, or I think the place where people have reached, is that actually it's more, that's a very dogmatic take on things, and in fact somebody like Tacitus or Suetonius came with a whole set of ideas about what appearance said about character. But what they fundamentally believed was that appearance did say something about character. I mean, that is something that was very, very well established. I think in the case of blushing, we'd be inclined to agree, because blushing is that thing that one does spontaneously that does seem to indicate a sort of an underlying psychological state. That said, somebody like Seneca, in the letter where he discusses blushing, I quoted a tiny bit of it, thinks very hard about what a high colour might say at different times of people's lives. So he talks about, I mean, offers as a precedent for the kinds of things Tacitus and Pliny are saying about Domitian, Sulla, the dictator. I can't remember quite what he says, but somewhat similar things about a sort of a face that indicated intense and constant shame at the terrible things that he was doing. Yes, in short, I mean, in respect of pallor and rubor in particular, these seem to be particularly clear ways in which humans unconsciously revealed their underlying characters. But obviously, as you've suggested, nobody does it better than Tacitus.
The theories of physiognomy show this interest for appearance clearly.
Yeah.
But I was wondering how much you were interested in the sort of chemical aspects, ancient chemicals, in terms of the skin displaying mixtures, and red being blood and the sign of divinity, red and hot, but also
Sure.
there's quite a lot of that in the doctors.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not generally very positive. I mean, it's not regarded as, I mean, a consistent tendency to blush well into your 40s or whatever Domitian is considered, you know, a form of disease, you know, quite potentially at any rate.
But I thought it could be also quite positive in the sense that, I mean, it would be a prevalence of blood, which is considered as quite positive. But I mean, by in terms of at least, I don't know, Galen and mixtures or something like that.
What would that? So I mean,
I think it would be that a prevalence of blood would be something quite positive in the sense that it would be linked with anger, for instance, which also reveals. I think it might be worth.
Yeah, I think absolutely right, and you know, anger is one way that it's understood with Domitian and with other sort of with Sulla, you know, with other figures in power who were of high colour. But obviously, anger in this sort of context isn't necessarily a positive thing. This is something that threatens the well-being of his senatorial subjects. But no, there is lots to chase up. But what I'm trying to do, because otherwise it would just completely run out of control, is link it to what the authors who were talking about Domitian, the way they kind of interpreted. And obviously in the case of the poets, they're tending in a very sort of metaphorical direction. They're not really concerned with the underlying medicine of it, as it were. You're more likely to see that kind of thing, or hints of that kind of thing, in Suetonius in particular, but also potentially in what Pliny and Tacitus have to say.
Thank you.
Are you suggesting that this sort of high colour of Domitian is seen as a positive thing by the people who want to praise him and a negative thing by the people who want to criticise him?
Yeah, well, I mean, essentially, but but that wouldn't in itself be of much interest. What's more interesting, I don't say more interesting, is that figures who set out to criticise Domitian and figures that set out to praise Domitian focus so much on his face, which seems such a big...
So in other words, he presumably did look like that?
Yeah.
Otherwise, there wouldn't be any point in both sides.
Well, he did, yeah, but Augustus also presumably had physical appearance as well. But does Horace and Virgil and Ovid talk about Augustus' face?
Yes.
Not with the intensity of...
Well, Suetonius, and they talk about his eyes in great detail.
Yeah, Suetonius
his hair and the colour of his hair.
The poets. Do Horace and Virgil and Ovid talk about Augustus' face?
I suppose really they talk about his hair and his gilded looks. But what I'm wondering about is whether you can see any trace of this in the art of Domitian's portraiture or his architecture indeed. Obviously, I'm not talking about the colour of the statues, but the use of the marbles or the colours of the marbles or the settings for the statues.
I don't know, but I don't know. I mean, because it's not an area that I've got any knowledge of at all. We'd be very lucky if any indication of that came through to us, would we not? Or I mean, also, I assume we can't really draw any conclusions from the prevalence of portraits as well, since the action of kind of erasing him must have had a kind of an impact on his the survival of his portraiture, but an impact that we can't actually quantify.